Winds sweep across a rugged coastline. Waves crash against towering white cliffs that rise from a restless sea. From the sky, the island appears small, an emerald fragment resting at the far western edge of Europe. Yet from this island would emerge forces that shaped the modern world. Empires, revolutions, wars that reshaped continents. For thousands of years, Britain has stood at the crossroads of invasion and innovation, isolation and influence. Its history is not simply the story of a nation. It is the story of how a small island came to wield global power. This is the story of Britain. Long before kings, armies, or empires, Britain was a land of forests and wild animals. Around 10,000 years ago, as the last ice age retreated, early hunter-gatherers moved across a vast plain connecting Britain to mainland Europe. This region, now submerged beneath the North Sea, is known as Doggerland. Here, ancient peoples hunted deer and wild cattle, gathering berries and roots while following the rhythms of the seasons. Gradually, the rising seas separated Britain from the continent. The island was born. By 4000 BC, a profound transformation occurred. Farming arrived. Communities cleared forests and cultivated wheat and barley. Permanent settlements replaced the wandering paths of hunters. With stability came culture, belief, and monument. Across the southern plains rose one of the most mysterious structures ever built. Stonehenge. Massive stones, some weighing over 20 tons, were transported from distant hills and arranged in a precise circular formation. Even today, its exact purpose remains uncertain. Temple, calendar, sacred burial ground. Whatever its function, Stonehenge reveals something extraordinary. Prehistoric Britain possessed organized societies capable of enormous collective effort. These were not primitive people struggling for survival. They were builders of monuments meant to endure for eternity. Around 800 BC, a new culture arrived from continental Europe, the Celts. They brought iron technology, stronger weapons, and more efficient farming tools. Britain soon became a mosaic of tribal societies. Warrior elites ruled hill forts that dotted the landscape, while Druids presided over religion, law, and education. The Druids held immense influence. They memorized vast bodies of knowledge, laws, rituals, histories, passed down through oral tradition. Roman writers later described them as philosophers, judges, and priests combined. But Celtic Britain was not unified. Tribes competed constantly for territory and prestige. Among these tribes were the Iceni, whose queen would one day become legendary. Boudica. But before her rebellion could shake an empire, another force was already approaching the island. Rome. In 43 AD, the Roman Empire launched a full-scale invasion of Britain. Emperor Claudius dispatched tens of thousands of soldiers across the English Channel. Disciplined legions advanced inland, crushing tribal resistance and establishing Roman authority. Britain became a frontier province of the empire. Roman rule transformed the landscape. Roads stretched across the countryside, connecting military forts and thriving towns. Bathhouses, temples, and marketplaces rose where forests once stood. The settlement of Londinium, modern London, became a bustling commercial centre. Yet Roman rule was not uncontested. In 60 AD, Queen Boudica of the Iceni led a massive uprising against Roman occupation. Her forces destroyed several Roman cities before being decisively defeated. The rebellion failed, but it became a symbol of resistance that would echo through centuries of British history. To defend their northern frontier, the Romans constructed one of the empire's most impressive engineering projects, Hadrian's Wall. Stretching across northern England, the wall marked the boundary between Roman Britain and the unconquered lands of Scotland. For nearly 4 centuries, Roman civilization shaped Britain. Then, in the early 5th century, the empire began to collapse. Rome's legions withdrew. Britain was left to face the chaos alone. Without Roman protection, Britain fractured into competing kingdoms. New peoples crossed the North Sea: Angles, Saxons, Jutes. These Germanic migrants gradually settled across much of England, forming kingdoms such as Wessex, Mercia, and Northumbria. This era became known as the Anglo-Saxon period. It was a time of shifting alliances, warfare, and cultural transformation. Christianity slowly spread across the island, carried by missionaries from Rome and Ireland. Monasteries became centers of learning and scholarship. But the greatest threat to Anglo-Saxon England arrived from the sea: Vikings. Beginning in the late 8th century, Norse raiders launched devastating attacks along Britain's coasts. Entire kingdoms fell to Viking armies. Only one major English ruler managed to resist them: Alfred the Great of Wessex. Through military reforms and strategic defense, Alfred halted Viking expansion and laid the foundations for a unified England. Yet the island remained vulnerable. And in the year 1066, a single battle would change Britain forever. When King Edward the Confessor died without an heir, several claimants fought for the English throne. Among them was William, Duke of Normandy. William invaded England with a professional army and confronted King Harold II near Hastings. On October 14, 1066, the two forces clashed in one of the most decisive battles in British history. By nightfall, Harold was dead. William had won. The Norman conquest transformed England completely. A new French-speaking aristocracy replaced the Anglo-Saxon ruling class. Castles appeared across the countryside, symbols of Norman authority. Feudalism reorganized land ownership and social structure. In 1086, William ordered a massive survey of his kingdom, the Domesday Book, documenting land, wealth, and population. It was one of the most comprehensive administrative records in medieval Europe. England had entered a new era. The Normans had conquered England. But conquest was only the beginning. Over the next 4 centuries, Britain would endure wars, rebellions, plagues, and political revolutions that would slowly redefine the balance between rulers and the ruled. Power would be challenged. Kings would fall, and the foundations of the modern British state would begin to emerge. The Norman conquest did more than place a new king on England's throne. It reshaped the entire structure of society. After his victory at Hastings, William the Conqueror redistributed land across England to his loyal followers. Vast estates were granted to Norman nobles, who in turn pledged military service to the crown. This was the feudal system. At the top stood the king. Below him, powerful barons controlled land and armies. Beneath them were knights, bound by duty and honor. At the base of society were peasants and serfs, whose labor sustained the entire structure. Stone castles rose across the countryside. Towering fortresses meant both to defend and to intimidate. They were reminders of Norman authority. Yet England was only one part of the Norman world. William and his descendants ruled territories stretching across the English Channel into France. This created a complicated political reality. English kings were also French nobles. Their loyalties were divided. Over time, tensions between the English crown and its powerful barons grew increasingly dangerous. Taxes rose to fund wars in France. Royal authority expanded, and resentment simmered beneath the surface. The medieval monarchy was powerful, but it was not absolute. Eventually, the barons would force the king himself to submit to the law. In the early 13th century, England was ruled by King John. John's reign was troubled from the start. Military defeats in France weakened the crown, and heavy taxation angered the nobility. Barons rebelled. In 1215, they forced the king to meet them at a meadow beside the River Thames known as Runnymede. There, under intense pressure, John sealed a document that would echo through centuries of political thought. Magna Carta, the Great Charter. Its clauses addressed feudal rights, taxation, and justice. But one principle stood above the rest. The king was not above the law. Even the monarch, the most powerful figure in the kingdom, could be bound by legal limits. At the time, Magna Carta was a practical compromise meant to calm a rebellion. But its legacy would grow far beyond its original purpose. Generations later, it would become a symbol of liberty and constitutional government, a reminder that power must answer to law. While internal struggles reshaped English politics, the Crown also faced fierce resistance beyond its borders. In Wales, English kings gradually expanded their authority through conquest and castle building. Edward I, one of England's most formidable medieval rulers, launched a series of campaigns in the late 13th century that finally subdued Welsh resistance. Massive fortresses, such as Caernarfon and Conwy, were constructed to secure English control. Scotland, however, proved far more difficult to dominate. In 1296, Edward I attempted to assert English authority over the Scottish throne. The result was war. Scottish resistance rallied around legendary figures such as William Wallace, whose victories against English forces inspired a national rebellion. Though Wallace was eventually captured and executed, the struggle continued. Another leader emerged. Robert the Bruce. In 1314, at the Battle of Bannockburn, Bruce's army defeated a much larger English force. The victory secured Scotland's independence for generations. These conflicts helped shape distinct national identities across the British Isles. England, Scotland, and Wales were connected by geography, but divided by politics and culture. In 1337, a new and devastating conflict erupted between England and France. It would last more than a century. The 100 Years' War began as a dispute over the French crown, but it evolved into a broader struggle for territory and power. English armies achieved stunning early victories. At the Battle of Crécy in 1346, English longbowmen devastated French knights, proving the power of new military tactics. A decade later, another triumph followed at Poitiers. For a time, England seemed poised to dominate France. But war brought terrible costs. Armies ravaged the countryside, economies strained under endless taxation, and amid the chaos of war, an even greater disaster arrived. In 1348, ships arriving from continental Europe carried an invisible passenger, a deadly plague. Within months, the disease spread across England and the rest of Europe. The Black Death. Villages were abandoned, entire families disappeared. Cities fell silent. Historians estimate that between 1/3 and 1/2 of England's population died. The social consequences were immense. With so many workers dead, labor became scarce. Peasants began demanding higher wages and greater freedoms. The rigid structure of feudal society started to crack. Old hierarchies weakened. A new economic order slowly began to emerge. The medieval world was changing, but the wars continued. In France, a young peasant girl would help turn the tide, Joan of Arc. Her leadership revived French resistance, and by 1453, England had lost almost all its French territories. The 100 Years' War ended in defeat. England returned its focus to its own internal struggles, and those struggles would soon explode into civil war. After decades of foreign war and political instability, England descended into a bitter internal conflict. Two rival noble families claimed the English throne, the House of York and the House of Lancaster. Their symbols, white rose and red rose, gave the conflict its name, the Wars of the Roses. For 30 years, battles, betrayals, and shifting alliances dominated English politics. Kings were crowned and overthrown. Nobles changed sides. Violence reshaped the ruling class. Finally, in 1485, the conflict reached its decisive moment at the Battle of Bosworth Field. A challenger named Henry Tudor defeated King Richard III. Richard was killed on the battlefield. The Plantagenet dynasty ended. A new dynasty began, the Tudors. Henry VII understood that England had been exhausted by decades of civil war. His priority was stability. He strengthened royal finances, reduced the power of rebellious nobles, and carefully managed political alliances. By the time of his death in 1509, the monarchy was more secure than it had been in generations. But his son would change England forever. Henry VIII began his reign as a Renaissance prince, athletic, intelligent, and ambitious. But history would remember him for something else: his break with the Roman Catholic Church. Henry's desire to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon led to a conflict with the Pope. When the Pope refused, Henry took a radical step. In 1534, the English Parliament passed the Act of Supremacy. The king, not the Pope, became the head of the Church of England. This decision transformed the religious landscape of Britain. Monasteries were dissolved, church lands were seized, religious authority shifted dramatically. The English Reformation had begun, and with it, centuries of religious conflict across the British Isles. Henry's daughter, Elizabeth I, would rule during one of the most remarkable periods in English history. Ascending the throne in 1558, Elizabeth faced religious division, foreign threats, and political uncertainty. Through careful diplomacy and strong leadership, she stabilized the kingdom. Her reign saw the flourishing of English culture. Playwrights like William Shakespeare produced works that would define English literature. Explorers such as Francis Drake sailed across the world's oceans. England was becoming a maritime power. This transformation was tested dramatically in 1588. Spain, the most powerful empire in Europe, launched a massive invasion fleet, the Spanish Armada. Its mission was to overthrow Elizabeth and restore Catholic rule in England. But storms, naval tactics, and determined English resistance shattered the Armada. The invasion failed. The victory transformed England's global confidence. The island kingdom had defeated Europe's greatest superpower, and it was only the beginning. At the beginning of the 17th century, the crowns of England and Scotland were united under one monarch. When Elizabeth I died in 1603 without an heir, the throne passed to her closest relative, the Scottish King James VI. Now he ruled both kingdoms as James I of England. It was the first time a single monarch governed the entire island of Great Britain. Yet unity at the top did not mean harmony below. The new Stuart kings believed strongly in the divine right of kings, the idea that monarchs ruled by God's authority and should not be challenged by earthly institutions. But England possessed something unusual in Europe, a powerful parliament. Members of parliament expected a role in taxation and governance. They believed the king could not rule alone. This disagreement over power slowly deepened. James I often clashed with Parliament, but his son Charles I pushed the conflict to breaking point. Charles ruled with a rigid belief in royal authority. When Parliament resisted his policies, he dissolved it entirely. For 11 years, he attempted to govern without it. Taxes were raised without parliamentary consent. Religious reforms angered Protestants. Political opposition grew steadily. By the early 1640s, distrust had hardened into hostility. England was moving toward civil war. In 1642, conflict erupted between the king and Parliament. The nation divided into two camps. Supporters of the king were known as royalists or cavaliers. Supporters of Parliament became known as parliamentarians or roundheads. What began as a political dispute soon became a brutal struggle for control of the kingdom. Battles spread across England, Scotland, and Ireland. Among the parliamentary commanders emerged a determined and disciplined leader, Oliver Cromwell. Cromwell believed the parliamentary cause represented not only political reform, but also religious destiny. He helped organize a highly trained fighting force known as the New Model Army, a professional military built on merit rather than noble birth. The results were decisive. In 1645, at the Battle of Naseby, the New Model Army shattered the royalist forces. Charles I was captured. After years of war and negotiation, Parliament made a decision that shocked Europe. In 1649, the king was tried for treason and executed. For the first time in English history, a reigning monarch had been publicly beheaded by his own people. The monarchy was abolished. England became a republic. In the years that followed, England was governed by Parliament and the army, but power increasingly concentrated in the hands of Oliver Cromwell. In 1653, he became Lord Protector, ruling the country with near dictatorial authority. Cromwell's government promoted strict Protestant values and attempted to reshape society according to religious ideals. His rule also extended military campaigns across the British Isles. Ireland was brutally subdued after a series of devastating sieges. Scotland was brought under English control. Though Cromwell maintained stability, his regime depended heavily on military authority. When he died in 1658, the fragile republic quickly unraveled. Within 2 years, the monarchy was restored. In 1660, Charles II, the son of the executed king, returned to England. Crowds welcomed him back. The monarchy had returned, but it could never be exactly the same. The experience of civil war and republican government had permanently altered the relationship between Crown and Parliament. Political tensions remained. Religious conflict, especially between Protestants and Catholics, continued to shape the kingdom's politics. When Charles II died, the throne passed to his brother James II. James was openly Catholic. In a nation where most people were fiercely Protestant, this caused deep concern. When James began placing Catholics in powerful government positions, many English leaders feared a return to absolute monarchy. In 1688, leading politicians took an extraordinary step. They invited the Dutch Prince William of Orange, who was married to James's Protestant daughter Mary, to invade England. William landed with an army. James fled the country. The event became known as the Glorious Revolution. It was remarkably bloodless by the standards of the time. William and Mary were crowned as joint monarchs, but they accepted new limits on royal authority. In 1689, Parliament passed the Bill of Rights, establishing that the monarch could not rule without parliamentary consent. Britain had taken a decisive step toward constitutional government. The balance of power had shifted permanently. While political revolution reshaped government at home, Britain's ambitions abroad were expanding. English ships had already begun establishing colonies across the Atlantic. In 1607, settlers founded Jamestown in North America. It was the first permanent English colony in the New World. Soon, others followed. Along the eastern coast of North America, 13 colonies emerged. Further south, British traders established plantations in the Caribbean. These colonies produced sugar, tobacco, and other valuable commodities. Trade networks expanded across the Atlantic, but this system relied on a brutal and inhumane foundation: the transatlantic slave trade. Beginning in the 17th century, British ships became heavily involved in a vast triangular trade network linking Europe, Africa, and the Americas. Manufactured goods from Britain were exchanged in Africa for enslaved people. These captives were transported across the Atlantic in horrific conditions during the Middle Passage. Many did not survive the journey. Those who did were forced to labor on plantations in the Americas. Sugar plantations in the Caribbean became especially profitable. The wealth generated from this system flowed back to Britain. Ports such as Liverpool and Bristol grew rich from the trade. Banks, merchants, and investors all benefited. Yet the human cost was immeasurable. Millions of Africans were uprooted from their homes and forced into slavery. The moral consequences of this system would eventually provoke fierce debate within Britain itself. By the late 18th century, abolitionist movements were gaining strength. In 1807, Britain abolished the slave trade, and in 1833, slavery itself was outlawed throughout the British Empire. But the legacy of those centuries would continue to shape global history. During the 18th century, Britain found itself locked in global rivalry with France. Both powers competed for influence across North America, the Caribbean, and India. These conflicts culminated in the 7 Years' War between 1756 and 1763. The war was fought across multiple continents. When it ended, Britain emerged as the dominant imperial power. France lost vast territories. Britain gained control of Canada and strengthened its position in India. But empire came at a cost. Maintaining distant colonies required enormous financial resources. Taxes increased, and in the American colonies, resistance began to grow. By the 1770s, tensions between Britain and its 13 American colonies had reached breaking point. Colonists objected to taxes imposed by Parliament, arguing that they lacked representation in the British government. Protests escalated into rebellion. In 1775, war erupted. Despite its powerful army and navy, Britain struggled to suppress the uprising. The colonies received support from France and Spain. In 1783, Britain formally recognized the independence of the United States. The loss of the American colonies was a major setback. Yet it did not end British imperial ambition. Instead, Britain turned its attention elsewhere. At the same time that imperial rivalries reshaped global politics, a quieter revolution was unfolding at home. It began in Britain. The Industrial Revolution transformed how goods were produced. New machines powered by steam replaced traditional manual labor. Factories emerged. Production accelerated dramatically. Textile manufacturing led the way. Innovations such as the spinning jenny and the power loom revolutionized cloth production. Coal mines expanded to fuel steam engines, ironworks multiplied, railways soon followed, connecting cities and markets at unprecedented speed. Urban populations grew rapidly as workers moved from rural villages into industrial towns. Cities like Manchester, Birmingham, and Glasgow became centers of manufacturing and innovation. But industrialization also brought hardship. Factories were often dangerous. Working conditions were harsh. Children labored long hours. The transformation of society was both dramatic and disruptive. Yet the Industrial Revolution also gave Britain a powerful advantage. Its factories produced goods faster and cheaper than rivals. Its navy controlled the seas. By the early 19th century, Britain had become the world's leading industrial and imperial power. It was the height of global Britain. As the 19th century progressed, the British Empire expanded across continents. India came under direct British rule. Colonies spread across Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. At its peak, the empire governed nearly a quarter of the world's population. But new challenges were emerging. Industrial rivals were rising. Nationalism was spreading, and the 20th century would bring two catastrophic wars that would transform Britain and the entire global order. By the dawn of the 20th century, Britain stood at the center of the largest empire the world had ever known. From Canada to India, from Australia to vast territories across Africa, British power reached every ocean and continent. It was said that the sun never set on the British Empire. The Royal Navy dominated the seas. British industry fueled global trade. London stood as the financial capital of the world. Yet beneath this apparent stability, tensions were rising. Across Europe, new industrial powers were emerging. Germany had unified and rapidly built a powerful army and navy. Nationalism surged across the continent. Military alliances divided the great powers into rival camps. Britain, once content to avoid permanent alliances, now found itself aligned with France and Russia against the growing influence of Germany and Austria-Hungary. The balance of power that had maintained relative peace in Europe for decades was beginning to crack. Then, in the summer of 1914, a single assassination ignited a chain reaction. On June 28th, Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria was murdered in Sarajevo. Within weeks, Europe was at war, and Britain would soon be drawn into the conflict. When Germany invaded Belgium in August 1914, Britain declared war. What many believed would be a short and decisive conflict soon descended into a brutal stalemate. Across the Western Front in France and Belgium, armies dug vast networks of trenches stretching hundreds of miles. Here, soldiers endured mud, disease, constant artillery bombardment, and the ever-present threat of sudden death. Battles such as the Somme and Passchendaele became symbols of unimaginable sacrifice. Millions of soldiers fought, and hundreds of thousands died. The war introduced terrifying new technologies: machine guns, poison gas, tanks, and aerial warfare. For the first time, modern industrial power was fully unleashed on the battlefield. Britain mobilized not only its own population, but also resources and soldiers from across the empire. Men from India, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Africa fought alongside British troops. The war became truly global. At home, society transformed to support the war effort. Factories shifted to producing weapons and ammunition. Women entered industrial jobs in unprecedented numbers. By 1918, exhaustion gripped all sides, but fresh American forces tipped the balance. Germany's armies collapsed. On November 11, 1918, the guns finally fell silent. The war had cost millions of lives, and although Britain emerged among the victorious powers, the conflict had profoundly weakened the empire's foundations. The years following the First World War were marked by uncertainty. Britain had expanded its empire after the conflict, gaining former German and Ottoman territories under international mandates. Yet maintaining such vast dominions was becoming increasingly difficult. Economic strain, rising nationalist movements, and the growing demand for self-determination challenged imperial control. Ireland became the first major break. After years of political struggle and armed conflict, most of Ireland gained independence in 1922, forming the Irish Free State. Northern Ireland, however, remained part of the United Kingdom. Elsewhere across the empire, calls for autonomy grew louder. At the same time, Britain faced severe economic challenges. The Great Depression of the 1930s brought widespread unemployment and hardship. Political tensions across Europe also intensified. Once again, in Germany, Adolf Hitler rose to power, promising expansion and revenge for the humiliations of the First World War. Another global conflict was approaching. In September 1939, Germany invaded Poland. Britain and France responded by declaring war. The Second World War had begun. Within months, German forces swept across much of Europe. France fell in 1940. Suddenly, Britain stood alone against the might of Nazi Germany. Prime Minister Winston Churchill rallied the nation with speeches that promised resistance at any cost. Soon, the conflict reached British skies. In the summer of 1940, Germany launched a massive aerial campaign intended to destroy the Royal Air Force and prepare for an invasion. This struggle became known as the Battle of Britain. Day after day, waves of German bombers crossed the English Channel. British fighter pilots scrambled to intercept them. The battle was fierce and relentless, yet the Royal Air Force held firm. Radar technology, skilled pilots, and determined resistance prevented Germany from gaining control of the skies. The planned invasion was abandoned. Churchill famously praised the pilots, declaring, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." But the war was far from over. German bombing raids, known as the Blitz, devastated British cities. London, Coventry, Liverpool, and many others suffered heavy destruction. Yet civilian morale remained remarkably resilient. Meanwhile, Britain fought across the globe, from North Africa to the Atlantic and beyond. The entry of the United States into the war after the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941 transformed the conflict. Together with the Soviet Union, the Allies slowly pushed back the Axis powers. By 1945, Nazi Germany had been defeated. The war in Europe ended in May. Later that year, Japan surrendered following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Second World War was over. Britain had survived, but the cost had been immense. The country was economically exhausted, and the empire that had once dominated the globe could no longer be maintained. In the years after 1945, the British Empire began to dissolve. The most significant turning point came in 1947. India, long considered the crown jewel of the empire, gained independence after decades of political struggle led by figures such as Mahatma Gandhi. But independence came with tragedy. The partition of India created two new states, India and Pakistan, and triggered one of the largest migrations in history, accompanied by widespread violence. Soon, other colonies followed. Across Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean, nations demanded self-rule. During the 1950s and 1960s, Britain granted independence to dozens of territories. Empire gave way to a new form of association, the Commonwealth of Nations. This voluntary organization linked former colonies and Britain through shared history, language, and cooperation. Though the empire was fading, Britain sought a new role in a rapidly changing world. After the Second World War, global power shifted dramatically. Two new superpowers dominated international politics, the United States and the Soviet Union. Their ideological rivalry became known as the Cold War. Britain aligned closely with the United States and Western Europe. In 1949, it became a founding member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. Although no longer the world's dominant power, Britain still possessed significant influence through diplomacy, intelligence, and its nuclear arsenal. The country also began rebuilding its economy and society after wartime devastation. In 1948, the National Health Service was established, providing universal health care. Social reforms expanded education, housing, and welfare programs. At the same time, immigration from former colonies reshaped British society. Communities from the Caribbean, South Asia, and Africa brought new cultures and traditions to Britain's cities. The United Kingdom was becoming a more diverse and multicultural nation. In the decades after the war, Britain sought to strengthen its economic ties with Europe. After initial hesitation, the United Kingdom joined the European Economic Community, the precursor to the European Union, in 1973. Membership linked Britain more closely with continental Europe in trade and political cooperation. However, the relationship was often debated. Many citizens supported integration, while others believed Britain should maintain greater independence from European institutions. These debates would continue for decades. Meanwhile, Britain itself underwent major economic transformation. Traditional industries such as coal mining and heavy manufacturing declined. New sectors, finance, technology, and services grew rapidly. London developed into one of the world's most influential financial centers. Despite challenges, Britain remained a major global economy. In 2016, the long-running debate over Britain's place in Europe reached a dramatic turning point. A national referendum asked voters whether the United Kingdom should remain in the European Union. The result was close, but a narrow majority, 51.9%, voted to leave. The decision, known as Brexit, triggered years of political negotiations and national debate. In 2020, the United Kingdom formally exited the European Union. Brexit marked one of the most significant political changes in modern British history. Yet it also highlighted deeper questions. Within the United Kingdom itself, opinions were divided. Scotland and Northern Ireland voted largely to remain in the EU, while England and Wales supported leaving. Discussions about the future unity of the kingdom, particularly the possibility of Scottish independence, became more prominent. The United Kingdom now faced the challenge of redefining its place in the world once again, from prehistoric stone circles to a global empire, from medieval kingdoms to modern democracy. The story of Britain is one of constant transformation. Across thousands of years, this small island nation helped shape global trade, language, science, politics, and culture. Its empire spread across continents. Its industrial revolution changed the world. Its people endured wars, revolutions, and dramatic social change. Today, the United Kingdom remains a complex and evolving society, balancing ancient traditions with the demands of the modern world. The future of the Union, like its past, continues to unfold, and the story of Britain is far from finished. If these ancient mysteries fascinate you, hit subscribe now and join us now as we uncover more secrets from the past.